And today's film opens with 8 men eating breakfast at a diner. 6 of them are wearing suits and are using aliases, which are Mr. Blonde, Blue, Brown, Orange, Pink, and White. Among them is a Los Angeles gangster Joe and his son, Nice Guy Eddie. And Mr. Brown discusses his analysis on Madonna's song Like a Virgin, entertaining everyone with his ramblings. And when it comes time for Joe to pay the bill for the meal, Joe tells everyone to throw in $1 for the tip. But Mr. Pink explains that he doesn't tip people and defends his anti-tipping policy by arguing that he shouldn't tip if he didn't get the best service. And the others argue with him, and he is then made to tip by Joe, who actually paid for the entire breakfast. And after the opening credits, the movie cuts to the interior of a car. Mr. White is driving with one hand and trying to comfort Mr. Orange laying in the back seat, who was shot in the abdomen and is bleeding and screaming in pain. They arrive at this abandoned warehouse, which was their rendezvous point, and Orange is in agony and begs White to take him to a hospital and promises that he will not tell the police anything. But White refuses and tells him that a private doctor will get there soon and reassures him by telling him that it's gonna take a long time for a shot in the abdomen to kill you. Mr. Pink comes to the shop shortly after and he starts screaming as he believes that their robbery of a jewelry store, which was orchestrated by Joe, was set up suggesting that one of the members might be a traitor. Pink concludes that this is because the police were there as soon as the gang started the robbery, and it shouldn't have been possible to have a dozen police officers appear at the store that fast if they weren't tipped off prior to the event. White, who didn't think about a traitor before, agrees with Pink's conclusion, and to fill the missing gaps, they tell their stories to each other. We are then taken to the flashback of Mr. Pink escaping from the jewelry store with the diamonds, and while running down the streets, he's chased by 3 or 4 policemen. Mr. Pink is hit by a car, which doesn't injure him heavily. He then drags out the woman who was driving and shoots at the policemen, hitting 2 of them before getting in the car and driving away. And back in the present, White informs Pink that Mr. Brown was shot and killed by the police during the getaway, and no one knows where Mr. Blonde and Mr. Blue are, which makes everybody suspicious of them. But they all agree to stay in the warehouse until Joe and Eddie arrive. We are taken to another flashback, which shows Mr. White meeting with Joe in his office, where he was offered a job in the upcoming heist in a few months. We also learn that Mr. White's real name is Larry, and he's a low-time criminal from Wisconsin. Mr. White agrees to do the job, trusting Joe's expertise, and back in the present, White and Pink discuss the actions of Mr. Blonde, who suddenly acted psychotic during the heist and killed several civilians in the store after the alarm had been triggered. And Mr. White is angry with Joe for including such an insane maniac in the robbery. Mr. Pink then reveals that he has hidden the diamonds in a secure location, and he tells White that they should go and get it, but White doesn't want to leave Orange, who's lying on the floor unconscious. He feels guilty about Orange shooting and doesn't want him to die, and Pink offers to take Orange to the hospital, but White tells him that they can't because he told Orange his real name, which they're technically not supposed to do, but he did. And Pink then gets angry and they get into a fight, and White beats him, and then they both point guns at each other, and Mr. Blonde, who's been watching them from the door, orders them to stop. White tries to take out his anger on Blonde and shouts at him for his actions during the heist, but Blonde doesn't seem bothered and calmly defends himself, saying simply that he warned the staff not to touch the alarm and that it's the civilians' fault for not listening to him. White was still angry with Blonde and points his gun at him, but Pink breaks up the fight. Blonde tells them not to leave the warehouse as he's spoken to Nice Guy Eddie, who's on his way there. He then tells them to follow him and takes them to his car, and he opens his trunk to reveal a captured police officer named Marvin. Apparently, Mr. Blonde here took Marvin as a hostage to escape from the jewelry store. Another flashback shows Mr. Blonde, who meets with Joe and Eddie at their office. We learned that Mr. Blonde was a previous worker for Joe, and he was caught during a heist, but he refused to give up Joe's name to the authorities. And then he served 4 years in prison, and now that he's released, Joe wanted to pay him back for his loyalty with a new job. And if the job was successful, it would have made everybody rich. In the present, White, Pink, and Blonde beat up Marvin and ask him to reveal who the rat is, but he tells them that he doesn't know anything about a setup. The beating continues until a furious Eddie arrives at the warehouse, and he scolds the guys over their incompetence to do the job, and he stops them from beating Marvin and orders Pink and White to take him to the stolen diamonds and dispose the 2 hijacked cars parked outside. He then orders Blonde to stay with Marvin and Mr. Orange until they return. The 3 leave the warehouse, and Blonde brings his his attention to Marvin, who promises him that he doesn't know anything, but Blonde reveals that he doesn't care if Marvin knows anything and that he will torture him because he enjoys torturing people. And he tells Marvin to pray for a quick death, which he tells him will not be happening anytime soon. He then turns on the radio and starts dancing, and then gets out his knife and cuts off Marvin's right ear. Marvin cries in agony but to no avail. Then Blonde gets a can of gasoline and pours it over Marvin, and Marvin starts begging not to get burned alive, and Blonde ignores it, but just before he could light the gasoline, he is hit by several shots. The shots came from Orange, who'd just woken up, and Mr. Blonde falls on the ground and dies immediately. Mr. Orange and Officer Marvin are now alone in the warehouse, and Orange reveals that he's a police detective named Freddy, but Marvin says that he already knew because he briefly met him several months earlier. And this shows us that he's resisted the beating and torture so as to not reveal Orange's true identity. Orange reassures Marvin that the police are waiting a few blocks away, but they're waiting to move in when Joe arrives. We are taken to another flashback, and this time with Orange's perspective. Orange was an undercover cop and he was sent on an assignment to capture Joe. We see Orange meeting his handler one night at a local diner where he tells him that he's in full with the gang after meeting Joe and nice guy Eddie earlier that evening at a nightclub that Joe owns. Next, we're taken to a further flashback within the flashback, and we see Orange rehearsing his cover story, which he calls the commode story, which is something completely fabricated that he's using to convince other people that he's a criminal. And he tells this fake story to the guys, and they're entertained by it, and they accept him into the gang. Later on, Orange goes with Eddie, White, and Pink on a drive where they discuss their favorite movie soundtracks from the 70s, and Eddie tells them a story about how a black waitress at one of Joe's nightclubs got even with her abusive husband, and as well as how black women seem to be more abused and angrier than white women. Orange mostly stays out of this very racist conversation, and before any of them knew it, they were silently being tailed by an unseen police detective to their hideout, which was a warehouse. And at the warehouse, Joe meets with all members of the gang where he gives them their aliases that we now know. He then goes over the responsibilities of each member in the upcoming robbery of the diamond store. And over the next couple of weeks, Orange develops a friendship with White, and we see them as they drive over the jewelry store to discuss their roles in the upcoming robbery. White tells Orange about a few methods of crowd control in human psychology and teaches him how to use them to his advantage. We are then taken to another flashback of the time of the robbery, and White, Orange, and Brown get into a car trying to get away, but Brown gets shot in the head and dies while driving, resulting in their car crashing. Orange and White get into a gunfight, and White kills the officers in sight, and they flee the scene and make it to another street. They stop a civilian car, but when Orange tries to throw the woman out of the car, she shoots him in the stomach, and Orange immediately shoots back and kills the woman. White then puts Orange in the car and starts driving like crazy, and now we're all caught up. And in the present, Eddie, White, and Pink return to the warehouse to find Blonde dead, and Orange, who's crawling on the floor, tells them that Blonde was going to kill Marvin, Orange, and the rest of the gang so that he could take the diamonds for himself. He claims that Blonde was the traitor and that he shot him to stop him. Mr. White and Mr. Pink believe him, but Eddie doesn't. And after briefly telling Blonde's backstory, he tells them that Blonde was a close friend of his and a loyal soldier of his father's. But Orange sticks to his story nonetheless, and it doesn't convince Eddie. And Eddie, who's now really pissed and confused at this point, decides to shoot at Marvin and kills him. Joe then arrives at the warehouse and he informs the group that Mr. Blue was killed by the police, and he then turns his attention on Orange and accuses him of being the traitor. White comes to Orange's defense and asks Joe what proof he has of this accusation, and Joe explains that all he needs to spot a traitor is his own instinct, claiming that Orange was the only person that he wasn't 100% confident about, and he then points his gun at Orange. And this causes White to point his gun at Joe, which causes Eddie to point his gun at White. And a standoff appears as White tries to convince Joe not to shoot, but Joe doesn't listen and he shoots Orange. And White shoots back at Joe and Eddie, but he also gets shot by Eddie, and after the gunfire stops, we see Joe and Eddie are dead, and White is severely wounded, and Orange is also mortally wounded, and Pink, who hid to avoid the shootout, takes the bag of diamonds and flees the warehouse. Shortly after, police sirens are heard outside, and White was hugging Orange, and Orange does reveal that he is in fact a cop, and he tells White that he's sorry most multiple times. White is devastated and begins to cry, and he points his gun at Orange's head, and the police then enter the warehouse and order White to drop the gun. But he refuses and shoots Orange, and the police then fire at White and the screen goes black as White drops to the ground. Yeah, pretty interesting movie. It's Tarantino's first movie. I really encourage you guys to check it out. Also, leave a like for my recap, leave me a comment, and most of all, subscribe to my channel. I love you guys so much, and I promise to see you on my next recap. Bye.